Think you're smart. Then fix this 28-year-old engine, the manager mocked the mechanic, but DeFrank Johnson Miller was wiping his grease-stained hands when Richard Thompson walked into the workshop with a smug grin. The dealership manager pointed to a rusted engine that had just been brought in by 2 employees. You think you're smart? Then fix this 28-year-old engine, Richard said with a loud laugh, crossing his arms as he watched the mechanic's reaction. If you manage it, I'll double your monthly salary. Frank stopped wiping his hands and looked at the engine. It was a 1996 model, completely rusted over, with broken parts and exposed wires. Any sensible person would say it was impossible to fix. And if I can't? Frank asked, already knowing the answer. Then you walk out of here and never come back, Richard replied, his grin widening. But of course you can refuse. No one will judge you for admitting you're not as good as you think. The mechanic felt his face grow hot. At 48, he had fixed thousands of engines from the simplest to the most complex. His reputation in town was impeccable, and all the customers sought him out specifically. I accept, Frank said, before he could even think it through. Richard clapped slowly as if applauding a mediocre performance. Perfect, you've got 1 week. I'll let everyone know the great Frank Johnson Miller accepted an impossible challenge. When Richard left the workshop, Frank approached the engine. The smell of rust and old oil filled his nostrils. This wasn't just a broken engine, it was a metal graveyard. That night at home, his wife Mary Ellen served dinner in silence. She knew that look on her husband's face, the same expression he had when he took on seemingly impossible challenges. Frank, you shouldn't have accepted, she finally said, setting the plate in front of him. He challenged me in front of everyone, Mary. How could I refuse? And if you can't, we need this job. Mom has her appointment scheduled for next month. Frank stopped eating. Mary Ellen's mother, 73-year-old Margaret, had heart problems and needed expensive treatment. The dealership's insurance only covered part of the costs. I'll fix it, he said. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure. On the first day, Frank arrived at the workshop before dawn. He started disassembling the engine piece by piece, photographing each step so he wouldn't forget how to put it back together. Soon, he realized the problem was much worse than he'd imagined. Richard showed up around 10 in the morning, accompanied by 2 office co-workers. How's it going, champ? He asked sarcastically. Slowly, Frank replied without taking his eyes off the engine. Slowly? Richard laughed. Look at this, everyone. The great mechanic is struggling. One of the employees, named Paul, stepped closer. Wow, Frank, this engine is really bad. Are you sure you can fix it? Frank felt all eyes on him. Other mechanics in the workshop had stopped working to watch. Of course I'll fix it, Frank said, but his voice came out less steady than he'd hoped. During lunch, Richard spread the news throughout the entire building. Soon, employees from other departments started showing up at the workshop to see the impossible challenge. Some cracked jokes, while others just shook their heads in pity. Frank tried to focus, but the laughter and comments distracted him. When he tried to remove a part from the cylinder head, it crumbled in his hands. Problem? Richard asked, returning with even more people in tow. None, lied Frank Johnson, stashing the broken pieces. That afternoon, he discovered the engine was an extremely rare model, discontinued over 2 decades ago. Replacement parts simply didn't exist anymore. He'd have to improvise or make everything from scratch. When he got home, Mary Ellen was in the kitchen, stirring a pot more forcefully than necessary. How'd it go? She asked without looking at her husband. Fine, Frank lied again. Frank Johnson, I've known you for 25 years. Don't lie to me. He sat at the table and told her about the impossible-to-find parts, the public humiliation, the engine's complexity. There's still time to back out, Mary Ellen said, sitting beside him. No, there isn't. I already accepted. My word means something. Your word won't pay for my mother's treatment if you get fired. Frank stayed up all night researching the engine model online. He found only 3 forums where people discussed the part's rarity. None had practical solutions. On the second day, he arrived at the workshop determined to find a solution. He started by calling every junkyard in the area. Most didn't even know what he was talking about. Richard showed up again, this time with his phone in hand. Folks, take a look at the state of our expert mechanic, he said, filming Frank. 2 days trying to fix an engine and hasn't made any progress. Frank tried to ignore him, but Richard kept narrating like a sports commentator. Day 2 of work, and the great Frank Johnson seems to have met his match. The 28-year-old engine is putting up a brave fight. Richard, cut it out, Frank said. Why? Everyone wants to know how the challenge is going. I'll post it on the company's social media. Mechanic accepts impossible challenge. It'll go viral. Frank's stomach twisted. It wasn't just his job on the line now. It was his reputation in the whole town. That afternoon, he visited 7 different junkyards. At the last one, he met an old man with white hair organizing antique parts. A 96 engine special model? The man asked, scratching his beard. Son, it's been years since I've seen one of those. You know it? Know it? I worked at the factory when they made that line. Few engines, a limited edition. Something different about it. Frank described some peculiarities he'd noticed. Ah, so it's one of those modified ones. There was a guy in town who loved tinkering with these engines. Died a few years back, but he made some adaptations nobody understood. What kind of adaptations? No clue, kid. I just assembled them at the factory. But he came here all the time looking for specific parts. Said he was improving the original design. Frank went home with more questions than answers. The engine wasn't just rare, it was one of a kind. Someone had altered the original design, making it even more complex. On the 3rd day, his daughter Brittany stopped by the workshop during lunch. At 23, she was in her final year of mechanical engineering and had always shown interest in her father's work. Dad, let me take a look, she said, approaching the engine. No need, Brittany. I'll handle it. Dad, I study this in school. Maybe I'll spot something you missed, Frank hesitated. Accepting his daughter's help meant admitting he couldn't solve it alone. But the deadline was closing in, and he'd made almost no progress. Fine, but just a quick look. Brittany examined the engine with the eyes of someone who studied modern theory applied to old equipment. After 15 minutes, she stopped and looked at her father. Dad, something's off here. What do you mean? Some of these parts were sabotaged recently. See here? She pointed to a component. This crack isn't from wear and tear. Someone forced it to break. Frank Johnson Miller stepped closer and examined where his daughter was pointing. She was right. The crack had very clean edges, as if someone had used a tool to force it open. Who would do this? I don't know, Dad, but whoever gave you this engine knew it was sabotaged. Frank felt anger rise in his chest. Richard hadn't just given him an engine that was impossible to fix. He'd deliberately sabotaged it to ensure failure. That afternoon, he confronted Richard in the office. You sabotaged the engine before handing it to me. Richard laughed, not even bothering to deny it. Prove it. My daughter spotted the marks. You forced some parts to break. So what? Richard leaned back in his chair. The challenge was to fix the engine as it is. It doesn't matter how it got that way. That's dishonest. That's real life, Frank. You accepted the challenge knowing I wanted to see you fail. Now deal with the consequences. Frank left the office wanting to punch the wall. Richard wasn't just testing his skills, he was setting him up to fail. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. That night, he told Mary Ellen everything. This changes things, Frank. If he sabotaged it, you can walk away without losing your dignity. No, Mary, now it's personal. He wants to humiliate me. Shall show him what a real mechanic can do. Frank, think about our situation. Mom needs to start treatment next week. I'll make it work, Mary. Trust me. But when he tried to sleep, Frank couldn't close his eyes. What if he really couldn't do it? What if Richard was right and he wasn't as good as he thought? On the 4th day, Frank arrived at the workshop and found Richard filming the engine. Good morning, champ. How's morale today? Why are you filming? Documenting the failure. I'll show everyone how an arrogant mechanic humbles himself when faced with a real challenge. Frank felt his blood pressure rise. He'd been struggling with high blood pressure for months, but never told Mary Ellen to avoid worrying her. Stop filming me, Richard. Or what? You gonna cry? Richard laughed loudly. Look, everyone, the great mechanic's getting nervous. Frank tried to ignore it, but his hands shook as he picked up the wrench. The stress of the last few days was taking its toll. Throughout the morning, he tried to focus on the engine, but every hour Richard showed up with more people. The workshop had turned into a spectacle, and he was the main clown. Around noon, while struggling with a particularly stubborn part, Frank felt a sharp pain in his chest. The world started spinning and he braced himself against the workbench. "Dad!" shouted Paul, one of the other mechanics, rushing to help. Frank collapsed right there on the workshop floor, surrounded by engine parts and spilled oil. When he woke up, he was in the hospital with Mary Ellen holding his hand. "The doctor said your blood pressure was dangerously high," she said, her eyes red from crying. "Frank, this isn't worth it." "How did I get here?" "Paul brought you. He said you passed out in front of everyone." Frank closed his eyes, humiliation burning in his chest. Now Richard had even more ammunition against him. The doctor entered the room, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression. "Mr. Johnson, your blood pressure was 180 over 120 when you arrived. That's extremely dangerous. Have you been under a lot of stress?" "A little," Frank lied. "A little," Mary Ellen snapped. "Doctor, he took on a challenge at work and hasn't slept or eaten properly in 4 days." The doctor shook his head. "Mr. Frank, at your age, this kind of stress can cause serious heart problems. You need rest, and most importantly, you need to resolve what's causing this anxiety." "I can't give up now, doctor." "Yes, you can," said Mary Ellen. "Frank, I'd rather have a husband alive and unemployed than a stubborn one in the cemetery." That night, Frank Johnson returned home against the doctor's wishes. Richard had called asking if he was going to quit the challenge due to health issues. "I'm not giving up," Frank Johnson said over the phone. "Are you sure? Because fainting at work wasn't very professional." "The clients are talking." Frank Johnson slammed the phone down. Richard was spreading the word that he had fainted from incompetence, not stress. On the morning of the 5th day, he returned to the workshop, determined to finish what he had started. But his hands still trembled, and the pressure in his chest hadn't completely gone away. While working alone, the other mechanics kept their distance on Richard's orders. Frank Johnson noticed something that had gone unnoticed in previous days. Inside the engine block, between two parts, there was a folded piece of paper. Carefully, he pulled out the yellowed paper and unfolded it. It was a handwritten letter in an elderly person's script. "To my son Richard, if you ever find this letter, know that I modified this engine especially for you. When you were little, you loved watching me work and said one day you'd own a workshop. I created a unique cooling system that no ordinary mechanic will understand. Only someone who knows this engine's story will be able to make it work again. I hope when you find this, you'll understand that the real value isn't in being the owner, but in respecting those who work with their hands. Your loving father, Anthony Thompson." Frank Johnson read the letter 3 times, trying to process the information. The engine belonged to Richard's father, and it had been modified on purpose to be a specific technical challenge. That changed everything. Richard didn't know about his father's modifications and truly believed the engine was beyond repair. The recent sabotage had only been to ensure Frank Johnson failed, but the real secret lay in the original changes. Frank Johnson tucked the letter away and kept working, now with a new perspective. If he could understand the system Richard's father had created, maybe he could not only fix the engine, but make it run better than ever. He spent the rest of the day studying the internal modifications. The cooling system had been completely redesigned, with extra ducts and a modified water pump. It was brilliant but too complex for any manual. That night at home, he told Mary Ellen about the letter, so Richard didn't know about these modifications. "From what I gather, no. His father was a mechanic too, and built this engine as a kind of gift or test." "And are you going to tell him?" Frank Johnson thought for a moment. "I'm not sure yet. First, I'll try to get the engine running." On the morning of the 6th day, Frank Johnson arrived at the workshop to find unusual activity. Richard was there with several men in suits, apparently investors or company executives. "Everyone, this is the mechanic who spent 6 days trying to fix an impossible engine," Richard said, introducing Frank Johnson like a circus act. "And is he succeeding?" asked an elegant woman. "Well," Richard laughed, Let's just say the experience has been educational, for him mostly. Frank Johnson felt his blood boil but controlled his anger. He had work to do. Throughout the morning, while Richard entertained the visitors, Frank Johnson worked on the modified cooling system. He was starting to grasp the logic behind the changes. Richard's father had created something revolutionary for its time. Around noon, Richard approached with the investors. "How's it going, champ? Made any progress?" "I'm getting there," said Frank, without taking his eyes off the engine. "I'm thinking of making some changes to the workshop," Richard said to the investors, loud enough for Frank to hear. "Modernize everything, bring in new technology. Maybe we won't need such outdated methods anymore." The message was clear. Regardless of the challenge's outcome, Richard was planning to get rid of the older mechanics. Frank tightened his grip on the wrench. It wasn't just his reputation at stake. It was the future of everyone at the workshop. By the afternoon, he had managed to assemble the modified cooling system. It was complex, but it was starting to make sense. Richard's father had created something ahead of its time. When he finished, it was already night and the workshop was empty. Frank looked at the nearly complete engine and felt a mix of pride and apprehension. Now came the hardest part, making everything work together. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. At home, Mary Ellen was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Frank arrived. "How was today?" "Better. I'm starting to understand how the engine works." "And the pressure? Are you feeling all right?" Frank felt a twinge in his chest, but didn't want to worry her. "I'm fine. Tomorrow's the last day. Either I make it or nothing, Frank. If you don't, life goes on. We'll find another way to pay for your mother's treatment." But Frank knew it wouldn't be that simple. At his age and after public humiliation, finding another job as a mechanic would be tough. That night he barely slept. Tomorrow would be Judgment Day. On the 7th and final day, Frank arrived at the workshop before dawn. He had a few hours of work before Richard showed up with the crowd for the grand finale. He started by connecting the last components of the cooling system. Every part had to be in the exact right place, or the whole system would fail. Around 8 in the morning, Richard arrived with even more people than the previous days, employees from every department, some investors, and even customers who had been invited to watch the show. "Good morning, Frank," Richard said with a victorious smile. "Ready for the big moment?" Frank kept working without answering. "Folks, today's the day," Richard announced to the crowd. "Our mechanic has until 5 this evening to get this engine running. If he succeeds, he gets double pay. If he doesn't, well, you all know the deal." The pressure was immense. Frank could feel dozens of eyes on him, waiting to see if he'd succeed or fail spectacularly. By mid-morning, he finished assembling the engine. Every part was in place. The cooling system was connected, and everything seemed right. But looking right didn't guarantee it would work. Richard approached with a phone camera. "Come on, Frank. The whole town's waiting. Fire up this beauty." Frank looked at the engine, then at the waiting crowd. His hands were sweaty and shaking slightly. "It's not ready yet," he said. "Not ready?" Richard laughed. "You've had a whole week." "I need a few more hours." "You don't have a few more hours. The deadline is today and it's already 2 in the afternoon. Frank felt panic rising in his chest. Technically, the engine was assembled, but he wasn't sure it would work. And if it failed in front of everyone, it would be the ultimate humiliation. "Just give me until 5, like you said." "Fine," Richard agreed, clearly confident Frank would fail. "At 5 sharp, you start this engine. If it works, you win. If it doesn't, you know what happens." The next 3 hours were the longest of Frank Johnson Miller's life. He checked every connection, every bolt, every wire. He manually tested the cooling system and verified the pressure at all points. By 4:30, the workshop was packed. Richard had invited practically the whole town to witness the grand finale of the impossible challenge. Frank looked at the engine, then at the crowd. He saw Mary Ellen and Brittany in the back, their faces filled with concern. He saw co-workers who were rooting for him and others who had bet against him. 5 o'clock, Richard announced. "Showtime, Frank." Frank stepped up to the engine. His hands no longer trembled. After a week of humiliation and stress, he had reached the final moment. He inserted the key into the ignition and glanced once more at Richard. "Before I turn it on, there's something you need to know." "I don't care what I need to know. Start that engine now, or admit you failed." Frank pulled the letter from his pocket and handed it to Richard. "I found this inside the engine. It's from your father." Richard took the letter with a puzzled expression. As he began to read, his face completely changed. The mocking smile vanished, replaced by shock. "Where did you find this?" "Inside the engine. Your father hid it for you to find." Richard read the letter again, his hands trembling slightly. He modified the engine for me?" "Not just modified. He created a revolutionary system. Your father was a genius, Richard." The workshop fell completely silent. Everyone sensed something important was happening, though they didn't quite understand what. Richard folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. "Start the engine," he said, but his voice had lost all its arrogance. Frank turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a smooth, steady hum. The sound was perfect, better than any 1996 engine had any right to sound. The crowd erupted in applause, but Frank didn't feel victorious. He looked at Richard, who stood frozen, staring at the running engine with tears in his eyes. "Your father was an incredible man," Frank said, shutting off the engine. "He loved you very much." Richard nodded, unable to speak. After a moment, he turned to the crowd. "The challenge is over," he said, his voice thick. "Frank succeeded." The crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about what they'd just witnessed. Some congratulated Frank, others just watched Richard, who remained standing beside the engine. When the workshop was empty, Richard approached Frank. "I didn't know about the modifications." "I figured. And yet you still fixed it." Frank nodded. "Why didn't you tell me about the letter sooner?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me, and maybe you wouldn't have cared." Richard was silent for a long moment. "You're right. I wouldn't have cared. Your father wanted to teach you something with this engine. What did he want to teach me? That it doesn't matter if you're the owner or the employee. What matters is respecting the work and the people who do it." Richard looked down at his own hands, clean and callus-free. "I've never worked with my hands. My father insisted I study so I wouldn't have to get dirty like he did. And there's nothing wrong with studying, but there's also nothing wrong with working with your hands. I humiliated you all week." "That's true. And yet you still gave me my father's letter." Frank shrugged. "It was yours, not mine." Richard stared at the engine for a few more minutes, lost in thought. "Frank, I want to make you an offer." "What kind of offer?" "I want you to run the workshop. Double the salary as promised, plus a bonus for achieving the impossible." Frank was stunned. "Why?" "Because you taught me more in 1 week than I learned in years of college. And because," Richard hesitated, "because I want to learn from you." "Learn what?" "To work with my hands, to appreciate what my father did, to be a better person." Frank Johnson looked at Richard and saw sincerity in his eyes. "All right, but on one condition." "What?" "We restore more of your father's equipment, together." Richard smiled for the first time in a week. No mockery, no sarcasm. "Deal." That night, Frank Johnson came home to find Mary Ellen waiting in the living room. "So? I did it. The engine worked." Mary Ellen rushed to hug him. "I knew you could do it." "And there's more. Richard promoted me to shop foreman, with double the pay." "Really?" "And he's giving a bonus. We can pay for your mother's entire treatment now." Mary Ellen started crying, but they were tears of relief and joy. How did Richard change his mind? Frank Johnson told her about the father's letter, the engine modifications, the talk they'd had afterward. So he didn't know his father had modified the engine? No, and the letter really got to him. I don't think he'd ever stopped to consider what his father actually did. And now? Now he wants to learn. He wants to work with me, restoring more of his father's things. Mary Ellen smiled. Maybe something good will come from all this after all. It definitely will. 3 months later, The workshop had completely transformed. Richard had truly learned to work with his hands, and under Frank Johnson's guidance, he discovered a natural talent for mechanics. They found several more of Richard's father's inventions stored in the garage of the house where he'd grown up. Each one was a different technical challenge, and together they learned to restore and improve the original designs. The workshop became famous in the area for its restorations. Customers came from neighboring towns to see old equipment running like new. Richard completely changed how he treated the employees. He started working side by side with them, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. Frank Johnson became not just the shop foreman, but also a kind of mentor to Richard. They developed an unlikely friendship, built on mutual respect and a shared love for mechanics. Mary Ellen's mother, Margaret, completed her treatment and made a full recovery. With Frank Johnson's new salary, the family even managed to renovate their house and buy a new car. Brittany graduated with her engineering degree and was hired by the dealership to work in the shop, bringing modern theoretical knowledge to complement her father's hands-on experience. A year after the challenge, Richard threw a party at the workshop to celebrate the anniversary of his father's letter. He invited all the employees, their families, and several customers who'd become friends. During the party, Richard gave a speech. "A year ago, I was a completely different person. Arrogant, disrespectful, blind to the value of honest work. A broken engine and a stubborn mechanic changed my life entirely." He looked at Frank Johnson. "Frank, you didn't just fix that engine, you fixed me too. You taught me that a person's real worth isn't in their title, but in the respect they show others." Frank Johnson was moved but tried to keep his composure. "Richard, you had the courage to change. That's worth more than any working engine." "Dad," Brittany said, stepping forward, "I want to show you something." She brought out a large package and set it on the workbench. "What's this?" Frank Johnson asked. "Open it." Frank Johnson and Richard unwrapped it together and found a bronze plaque with an engraving, "Anthony Thompson Workshop, where tradition and innovation work together." "Brittany, this is beautiful," said Richard, running his hand over the letters. "I thought it was time to truly honor your father," she said, "and to show that this workshop represents everything he believed in." Richard hugged Brittany, then Frank Johnson. "Thank you, both of you, for giving me a second chance." "Everyone deserves a second chance," said Frank. "What matters is what we do with it." That night, when the party ended and everyone had left, Frank stayed alone in the workshop for a few minutes. He looked at the 28-year-old engine, now running perfectly and displayed as a symbol of the workshop's transformation. He thought about how much his life had changed in just 1 year. The challenge that should have humiliated him had instead become the greatest victory of his career. Mary Ellen appeared at the workshop door. "Ready to go home?" "Ready," said Frank, turning off the lights. As they walked to the car, Mary Ellen asked, "Any regrets?" "About what?" "About taking on that impossible challenge." Frank looked back at the workshop, now bearing Richard's father's name, at the place where one of the most profound human transformations he'd ever witnessed had taken place. "No regrets," he said. "The best things in life sometimes start with the worst moments." "And if you hadn't been able to fix the engine?" Frank thought for a moment. "I think I would have managed anyway, because the engine wasn't the real challenge." "What do you mean?" "The real challenge was fixing two men, one who was losing faith in himself and another who was losing his humanity." Mary Ellen smiled and took her husband's hand. "And did you manage to fix yourselves?" "We did. And do you know the secret?" "What?" "Understanding that no matter how old something is, it can always be restored if you have patience, knowledge, and most of all, heart." They got into the car and drove home, leaving behind the workshop, where a 28-year-old engine had taught 2 generations about respect, humility, and the transformative power of forgiveness. The end. Now, tell me what you thought of this story of overcoming and transformation. Do you believe people can really change the way Richard did? Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories.